Today, Moscow is a metropolis of over 11 million people. But 800 years ago, it was a small village on the banks of the Moskva River. A modest settlement surrounded by simple wooden defenses. It gave little indication of its future greatness, or its ability to evolve through adversity. Moscow was frequently attacked and destroyed. Yet each time, it rose from the ashes, stronger and better defended. Its first real test came in 1238. This time, they faced a new enemy: the Mongols. Moscow had been largely unaware of the growing threat in Central Asia. Genghis Khan, founder of the Great Mongol Empire, had conquered most of the Asian continent. His descendants continued his work to expand the empire. His grandson, Batu Khan, led the armies of what would become known as the Golden Horde. Their goal: to extract money from principalities they conquered. One by one, states in the region, known collectively as the Rus, fell to the Golden Horde. Moscow was next. In 1238, the Mongol Golden Horde surrounded Moscow and besieged its wooden walls. It would only hold out for 5 days. Moscow burned. That could have been the end of its story, but the people of Moscow were resilient. They would not give up their home or their control of the Moskva River, an important trade route. They began to rebuild and strengthen Moscow's defenses. Yet one question remained: would the terror return?
(13) 1272. One three.
Horse archers were elite troops who galloped into battle, shooting their bows from the saddle, arrow after arrow after arrow.
The key to horse archery is being able to fit an arrow to the string, draw it back, and release very, very quickly. Horse archers use a special device called a thumb ring, and this gives us a special technique to lock the arrow onto the bow and shoot.
With the thumb draw, the arrow is placed on the right-hand side of the bow. And so taking an arrow from the quiver and onto the string was extremely efficient, allowing horse archers to shoot in rapid succession.
The three main shots are the forward shot, the side shot, and the back shot, also called the Parthian shot.
Both Moscow and the Mongols had a horse archery tradition that stretched back for centuries. Their armies were well matched with these light and versatile troops, and their conflicts were characterized by the horse archers' fluid style of warfare. Horse archers were famed for their surprise attacks. In Moscow's armies, they could be deployed rapidly in many different terrains, and then appear as if from nowhere. In addition to being expert with their bows, they used both javelins and swords for close-quarter fighting. Attacks could come from any side, so horse archers had to shoot both left and right-handed. shots taken behind the head offered additional variety in the angles of attack. They were also expert at swarming across an enemy's front to decimate his lines. They were quick to retreat, and just as quick to renew their attacks. Horse archers were Moscow's crack troops. They patrolled the borders and held them against invaders.
One 375.
By 1303, Moscow controlled land that encompassed the entire flow of the Moskva River. Its ambitions didn't end there. Moscow continued to expand its borders through its wealth rather than warfare. Its tactic was to buy land from bankrupt rulers, acquiring entire towns and villages in the process. As Moscow was still a vassal of the mighty Mongol Empire, it had to send envoys to pay them tribute. And Moscow's ever-expanding borders meant more and more revenue for the Mongols. But not everyone was content with the rise of Moscow. As Moscow grew in power and influence, its Grand Prince, Dmitry Ivanovich, reinforced its vulnerable defenses. Its wooden fortress, the Kremlin, was rebuilt. This time, in stone. But even stone walls didn't deter its enemies. By 1368, Lithuania saw rapidly expanding Moscow as a real threat. Joining forces with the Principality of Tver, they set out to challenge its dominance. They attacked Moscow. But the stone walls held, and the enemy retreated. Tension between the factions refused to die down. In 1370, Moscow marched on territories belonging to both Tver and Lithuania, igniting a full-blown war. Years of bloody conflict ensued, until Moscow's Grand Prince Dmitry Ivanovich finally defeated both enemies. Yet Moscow was still a vassal of the Mongol Empire, which still demanded tribute. Moscow must keep up the payments or face retribution.
One 3.
Medieval Moscow, Muscovy, was shielded by vast forests, which slowed the advance of approaching enemies. These woodlands were also an abundant source of timber for building wooden forts. Forts built within urban settlements were called Kremlins. The original Kremlin in Moscow, from at least the 12th century, was made entirely from wood, as were all buildings in the city. To understand how these forts were constructed, a scaled-down version is being made.
Moscow built forts in vast numbers. You can see they had an ingenious way of doing it. These standard lengths of wood have V-shaped notches cut into the end, and then they can be simply overlaid into a box construction which forms a cell. No joints, no nails, just the sheer weight will keep them in place.
Stacked together both vertically and side by side, these cells created astonishingly resilient walls. They were far better at withstanding attacks from mighty siege engines than simple vertical palisades. And the box construction of Muscovy forts also had a number of other advantages.
By filling them with earth or with stone, it made them not only stronger than a single wooden palisade, but it also gave them sturdiness and elasticity which could better absorb the impact of projectiles from trebuchets. And the other advantage of these box structures is that they could be prefabricated. Now, the first step in that process is taking off the bark.
This stops wood-eating insects from sheltering beneath the bark and allows the wood to dry, preventing it from rotting.
By taking off the bark, this wood will then last for years.
Prepared timbers could be stored and then assembled into cells, wherever and whenever needed. And some cells, both on the walls and the gatehouse towers, were not filled with earth. Instead, they were left empty for defenders to use. From the 13th century, some towers were made of stone and brick, like this one at Chertsk Castle, built in 1388.
When stone wasn't available locally, red brick was the material of choice. Of course, the advantage of using bricks is that they're easy and cheap to manufacture, they're uniform, so easy to build with, and it's these red bricks which give the distinctive look to Eastern European castles, which we can still see to this day.
Stone and brick towers could be built much taller than wooden ones. This allowed Moscow's defenders to spot potential attackers sooner, keeping their enemies at bay.
(1380)
Under Grand Prince Dmitry, Moscow had grown rich and allied itself with old adversaries. Together, the Rus allies were ready to challenge the dominance of the Mongols and stopped paying them tribute. On the banks of the River Don, Dmitry would stake his life on being the first Rus leader to defeat the Horde in battle.
(1988–600) (13)
The might of medieval Moscow was powered by strong arms and an unbreakable fighting spirit.
Fighting with a sword and shield, eye to eye in a gritty and brutal contest, was the European way. Swords in Moscow developed along the same lines as they did in Western Europe. This is a typical sword of around 1400. It's got a broad, double-edged blade, a simple crossguard, and this heavy pommel counterbalances the blade.
They were so well balanced that these powerful medieval swords were capable of being wielded with great speed and fluidity.
By the 14th century, improvements in the manufacture of iron made it possible to fashion swords with longer blades. And swords like this, requiring two hands to wield, became more and more common on the battlefield.
They were called long swords, and they were used with sophisticated martial techniques.
It does have incredible and terrifying power.
But there was another influence on Moscow. Moscow traded with the East, and Moscow fought with the East. And it was from the east that Moscow adopted the saber, with its distinctively curved blade. The curve on a saber blade gives a natural slice to the cut, so cutting deeper for less effort. These exceptionally light swords were first and foremost a horseman's weapon.
As a single-strike weapon, using the speed of the horse for impact, it was one cut onto the next.
But cutting wasn't their only use.
Even with a curved blade, you can still deliver an effective thrust.
However, for all their cavalry dash, the old ways of standing firm remained part of the Muscovy way, forging a military culture that was a unique blend of West and East.
One 382.
On the morning of September 8, 1380, at Kulikovo, the Moscow-led Rus army defeated the Mongols for the first time. One of the key battles of the medieval age, it was a transformative event in the rise of Moscow as the future capital of Russia. For the first time, rival principalities had joined Moscow to fight a common enemy. Now, many Rus principalities began to see themselves as one. Future leaders of Moscow would draw on the memory of this battle to claim their supreme political position in Russia. Moscow's Grand Prince, Dmitry Ivanovich, had led the Rus principalities to victory over the Mongols, reinforcing his dominance. But for the Mongols' leadership, the defeat at the Battle of Kulikovo was disastrous. The ruler of their Golden Horde was overthrown by a descendant of Genghis Khan. His name was Toktamish. And Toktamish was not going to let the treacherous Moscow-led Rus get away with rebellion. 2 years after their defeat at Kulikovo, Toktamish's Golden Horde set out to attack Moscow. The city had not felt the wrath of the Mongols for more than a century. That was about to change.
One 3.
Among both the armies of Moscow and the Golden Horde were strange-looking creatures. Grotesque, sinister faces that struck terror into a foe.
There's a very long history of making helmets with mask visors with human features in the ancient Near East. Moscow was heavily influenced by this metalworking tradition, using the art of embossing to hammer these extraordinary sculptural forms into the steel.
To make these masks required highly skilled artisans. In present-day Poland, Adam Mazia is a master of the craft. The process begins with a thick, flat sheet of wrought iron. The hammer stretches and domes the plate. The beginnings of a face. As the metal is pushed out, it becomes thinner and so easier to work. Adam marks a center point and an outline of the nose. This is the only guide he uses. All else is done by eye alone.
In Western Europe during the late Middle Ages, helmet design was all about function. What shapes are going to form glancing surfaces that make weapons skate and bounce away from the face? In Moscow, however, the approach was rather different. They sacrificed quite a lot of protection for the sake of extraordinary visual impact.
There is a limit to which the metal can be stretched, and so a slot is cut to allow the nose to be shaped. Released from the bonds of the rigid plate, the nose takes on its distinctive form.
In a way, armor is always a mask. It forces the world to see us as we want to be seen. Strong, powerful, indomitable. These Muscovite mask visors are an extraordinary example of that projection of identity. In some cases, they were actually made as portraits in the image of the wearer.
With every strike, the features become more and more recognizably human. The furnace imbues the mask with a warrior's fury.
When finished, the visor is given a high polish and attached to its helmet with this rotating hinge that allows the visor to be raised and stowed when not in use. But it can always be quickly lowered as soon as danger threatens.
A man could project his power with such a mask. A man could hide his fear with such a mask. And by doing so, he could be brave.
One 478.
In the century following the Mongols' vengeful attack on Moscow, Dmitry Donskoy's son and grandson clung to the Rus throne. Amid old rivalries and fragile alliances, Dmitry's great-grandson Ivan III set out to consolidate Moscow's control over all the Rus. But one independent republic would not yield to Moscow, the wealthy commercial center of Novgorod.
One 3. 1480.
While Ivan III consolidated Moscow's power, the Golden Horde was succumbing to discord. Seizing on this weakness, Ivan withheld tribute, equipped his men with firearms, and marched to meet the army of the Khan. On the banks of the Ugra River, the Rus stood defiant, prepared to contest over 200 years of Mongol dominance.
One 3.
From long, harsh winters to Mongol invasions, life for Muscovite peasants was tough. But they had one crop that was vital to their survival: rye. Moscow peasants relied on cereal crops more than any other food. To separate the grain from the straw, cereals had to be threshed with a flail. This tool could also be repurposed for battle.
When the Grand Prince called upon peasants to serve in the army, they would have become armed with their tools of the trade, their pitchforks and their pikes, but chief amongst their weapons would be the flail.
Farming crops in a land that was covered in snow for 6 months of the year was challenging. But rye was one crop that was particularly adapted to the extreme Moscow climate.
The thing about rye is it's incredibly hardy. If you can sow it in autumn, it'll grow through the winter months, even with a covering of snow on the ground. Now, Russia is famous for its long, cold winters, but it also gets very hot and dry summers, and it's in those drought conditions that rye also thrives. And it's for that reason that a majority of Moscow peasants were growing this stuff.
But they didn't get to keep all of their crop. The largest rye grains were given to the Grand Princes as tax, while the rest would be used to make bread, or malted to make a nourishing, non-alcoholic drink, kvass.
It's super easy to make and cheap, really cheap. It's great for helping tired muscles recover, and it's just quite refreshing, and also helps control infections.
Muscovite soldiers drank kvass as part of their daily rations. It's made by first adding ground malted rye to boiling water. After cooling, yeast culture is added, causing the mixture to ferment. This kills off any germs in the water.
There you go.
Around 3 days later, the kvass is ready to drink.
The bubbles are really starting to come up now.
Yeah.
Just the yeast doing its work. На здоровье.
На здоровье. What are the special qualities of this drink then?
It's essentially a probiotic drink. It has a lot of B vitamins and it has lactic acid, which is great for recovering from hard labor. It's kind of an ideal sports drink, really.
And with rye so easy to grow, you can see how this was the sort of saviour, if you like, of the Moscow peasantry.
The hardiness and versatility of rye was a lifesaver to Muscovites, both for peasants at home and soldiers on campaign.
One 514.
In 1480, Moscow's army, led by Ivan III, faced off against the Mongols across the banks of the Ugra River. But the Muscovites, armed with guns, were too much for the Mongol army. When the Mongols realized reinforcements weren't coming, they retreated. Now Ivan III was free to pursue his ambitions, to expand Moscow even further. Despite the rapid rise of Moscow, it was still a vassal of the Mongol Empire. But after the stand at the Ugra River, Ivan III's ongoing refusal to pay tribute antagonized the Mongols. Yet, retribution never came. Cracks had developed in the highest levels of Mongol rule, and the Golden Horde shattered into smaller khanates, beset by infighting. So Moscow was left free to expand. Ivan III continued taking control of smaller Rus principalities by any means necessary. Some had been ruled for over 100 years by an historic enemy, Lithuania. Ivan III was determined to take them back. By 1500, he had turned Moscow into more than just a city or a state. It was an entity that he claimed represented all the Rus people. Ivan's successor, Vasily III, would fight to take back the lands from Lithuania that he believed belonged to Moscow.
1498. 131552.
Following Moscow's growth in the west, Ivan IV ascended the throne and took up the eastern expansion plans of his ancestors. The Tatar Khanate of Kazan lay just across the border. But the Tatars had resisted many Rus sieges in the past. In his final attempt to capture the Tatar lands, Ivan would deploy bold new strategies.
One three.
Streltsy is the Russian word for shooters. And from the late 15th century, the armies of Moscow had included regular troops, armed with an arquebus, a standard firearm in all European armies at the time.
This is an arquebus. It's an early type of musket. To load it, you put a charge of black powder down the barrel. The ammunition is a lead ball.
A paper wad seals the charge.
Then both ball and wad are rammed home tight.
To shoot the gun, priming powder is placed in the pan.
The priming is lit by a match. Now, a match was originally a length of cord soaked in saltpeter, so that it burns slowly but continuously, and even in poor weather.
When lit, this sends a flame through a small hole at the base of the barrel, which lights the main charge. One of the great advantages of the arquebus was that the ammunition was inexpensive and easy to make. Molten lead was poured into a special mold. It cooled to a solid state in seconds, making it possible for vast quantities of lead balls to be produced. They were finished by trimming off the excess lead, which was known as a sprue. Streltsy received regular payment of both money and bread, and they lived with their families in purpose-built settlements called slobody. Streltsy were a new type of army, ordinary troops recruited from tradespeople and farm workers.
An early arquebus had an extremely heavy barrel.
To shoot it with accuracy, the gun had to be steadied, and Streltsy had a unique solution.
This is a type of axe called a bardiche, and for the Streltsy, it doubled as a gun rest.
Arquebus men were usually vulnerable to cavalry.
Even with experience, reloading takes time, and cavalry covers ground very speedily. Once you've shot, your position becomes perilous very, very quickly. However, with the scything power of a bardiche, a Streltsy has at least the chance to withstand a cavalry onslaught. It took a brave cavalryman to ride into a hail of bullets, but an even braver one to face the horror of these axes.
Over time, Moscow's armies recruited more and more men armed with guns. Inexpensive troops who changed the way war was waged. Ivan IV had broken through the walls of the ancient city of Kazan, and his army flooded the streets. They hunted down its defenders and their allies, and brutally sacked the city. Kazan had fallen to the unstoppable military might and strategic innovation of the Muscovite war machine. In the years that followed, Ivan IV waged war after war to bring vast new territories under Moscow's rule. By 1547, he had declared himself the first Tsar of all Russia. And his never-ending fight for territory set the course for those who ruled after him. Moscow was no longer a small fort on the banks of the Moskva River. It had survived centuries of Mongol oppression and wars with its neighbors. Its evolution from fort to city to state and to empire would continue. Moscow's rise transformed Russia into one of the world's greatest superpowers.